Welcome to Grandma Magic, a podcast from the Grandmother Collective. We are a nonprofit organization that supports and advocates for a world where a grandmother's power is seen, cultivated, and activated for positive change. The Grandma Magic podcast is an opportunity to learn more about the unique roles that grandmothers, aunties, and other older women around the world play in advancing positive social development by talking to and learning from grandmother changemakers. We hope this series inspires you, brings you joy, and helps you recognize the enduring magic and wisdom that comes from grandmothers everywhere. My name is Lindsay Farrell, the co-founder of the Grandmother Collective and host of the podcast. Today, we're going to do something a little different. Our writer, Nina Valenbreder, recently interviewed Ruth Ochieng. Ruth Ochieng is a Ugandan peace activist, gender justice advocate, and expert in post-conflict transformation. She served as the executive director of Isis-WICCE International Cross-Cultural Exchange, a Kampala-based women's resource center that moved from Geneva to Uganda in 1993 to address the root causes of gender-based violence and conflict. Under her leadership, ISIS centered African women's perspectives in global peace-building efforts. Having survived violence herself during Uganda's civil war, Ruth has dedicated her career to advocating for women who have endured conflict and trauma. She and her team documented cases of sexual violence and pioneered holistic survivor-centered programs, integrating medical, psychological, and economic support to help women heal and rebuild their lives. Ruth's work has inspired global initiatives, with the model being replicated in other post-conflict countries. She continues to lead training programs that strengthen women's leadership and peace building, firmly believing that true recovery is impossible without healing and empowering the women most affected by conflict. We're so delighted that we're able to share the summary of this with you as well on Substack, and take a listen.
So welcome, Ruth. How are you doing today?
Thank you very much, Nina. Maybe I'll need to start by saying I'm so excited to be here to talk about the different work I have been doing, but probably I need to start by saying I was the executive director of Isis-WICCE, but he stepped down in 2016 after working for over 20 years as an executive director of this international women's organization, which today is called Women International Peace Center. The name changed because of the rebels who are fighting in Afghanistan and other parts of the Arab world called ISIS. And because we did not want to be associated with the group, because of our lovely name that we got from our founders in 1994, which meant Isis, the goddess, and the goddess who really worked so hard for its communities. We sadly had to leave the name just because we did not want to associate ourselves with. But who is Ruth Ochieng now? Ruth Ochieng is a grandmother who is retired but not tired, who continue working with women in situations of conflict and, of course, other conflicts that the world seem not to be recognizing as conflict, and they are defined differently. But as far as women are concerned, these are conflicts. And you can imagine how these senior women have to drive through, have to work through the intersectionality of these different conflicts in their lives. The conflict of climate change, it still affects them. The conflict of domestic violence, which the world has termed it as domestic violence, but it is a conflict on the women's bodies. And of course, the known armed conflict, which again brings a multitude of conflicts on the bodies of women, and especially the grandmothers who have seen it all as survivors, as protectors, as promoters of peace, and defenders of women's human rights.
Thank you so much for that update. So I think speaking on the breadth of conflict on women and older women especially, who seem to have this experience through which they carry the conflict kind of through their bodies, right? Would you be able to perhaps share a bit about your personal experience with conflict living in Uganda during the Civil War, and maybe how that influenced your work and starting what's now called the WIPC, I assume?
Well, I'm not going to preempt my book, which is now at the final part of editing.
Okay.
But conflicts have been with us on this continent as way back as when we were children, before I even became a grandmother. I've gone through a number of conflicts. For example, here in Uganda, in 1966, when I was just finalizing my O-level, there was a crisis between government Uganda then and the kingdom, one of the largest kingdoms in Uganda, a tribe called Baganda, who take up the central part of Uganda. As if that was not enough, as I entered my university in 1974, there came another violence. That was the time when 1977, when Idi Amin was the president of Uganda. And of course, he was a guy who oppressed anybody who felt like was intelligent, was utilizing education as a way of defending the rights of other people. And at the university, we really fought against his dictatorship, and we saw so much happen to women who are today old women as students at the university. Then it came to 1978. I was out of the university, and this was another regime. There was a group of liberators from Uganda who had run to Tanzania to fight the dictatorship of Idi Amin. And in 1978, they entered Kampala, the capital city of Uganda. They entered 78 and 79, the whole of 78 there was fighting, and 79 I had just given birth to my first child. And it was just God's blessing that I was able to give birth to this child, because I started feeling the pains, the bullets and whatever were being thrown across Kampala. So lucky enough, I managed to get into the hospital. And of course, they found out that my child was not sitting properly in the stomach, and it was a breech. So I had to go through cesarean. But just immediately they removed the baby. They rolled me back into the room. They pushed another mother on the bed to operate her. She had twins, and sadly for her, she did not make it. And definitely, as they were trying to teach her back, that's the story I got, they could not save her life and the life of one of the twins. And I think it was at that time that I went on asking myself, there must be a reason why it was not me, the second one. Probably I should have been the second one, but here I was the first to be operated. I survived, my baby Emmanuel survived. So there must be a reason why I went on surviving so many of these crises. And in 1994, Isis-WICCE, which is now the Women International Peace Center, moved from Geneva, where it had its headquarters, to Uganda. I will not go into the details of how it moved and why it moved. That one, you will find it in my book. But when it came, by that time I was working with the Minister of Justice. I was the Attorney General's librarian. And I had just come back from my master's degree in City University. And when I saw the application, the advertisement, I said, this is my job, because it aligned so much with what I had read at my master's in communication policy studies. So I applied, and it took ages. Little did I know that they were vetting, wanting to know, as feminists, they felt they really needed to get a feminist into this job. And by the way, at that time, I had not even had a clue of who a feminist is. It's the way it was advertised. It aligned with what I had read. It aligned with my passion of working with very disadvantaged people. And I applied. And there I was. After 6 months, I was called. And I got the job. This was in 1995, as we were preparing for Beijing. And my first trip on a feminist thinking was to the Beijing conference. And I think this is where I opened up to understand a lot of what women were going through. I could not believe in my lifetime that all this were happening on women's bodies. And since Isis-WICCE had gone to test it to see if it can research, it can engage with the women on the continent on issues of women and conflict, it affirmed to us that that was the area. I saw women from the young to those as old as 80 years talking about conflict. And of course, the different dimensions of conflict. And that was the beginning of my journey with talking, engaging, and trying all the advocacy that I could come up with to heal the body, mind, and soul of survivors of armed conflict.
So was it then really recognizing how many people were invested in this work and seeing the community that was existing at that time for this kind of work that inspired you?
What inspired me was, remember, my history of going through conflict. But the most important was that every woman who was in Beijing, in the workshops that I attended, was asking, what happens to women in situations of armed conflict? What is it that is happening? The few who managed to come there, the stories that they were talking about, you could not just imagine that a human being would do such a thing to another human being. So that inspired me, because back in Africa, there were so many countries that were in conflict, and the majority of women who are talking about before conflict, Sierra Leone, Liberia, leave alone my own country, Uganda, all of them were talking about the conflict. But it looked like very few of the activists who are in Beijing could really touch on the voices of these women. It looked to me as if this was the first time majority of us were hearing the real testimonies of women who had gone through such crisis. And being a documentalist, I felt if I don't do this, then no other person will do. Because if Isis-WICCE, which is Women's International Peace Center's reason for coming from Geneva to the continent was to tap the voices of the African women, which was lacking in the documentation center, then I took upon myself as an obligation that the women's voices, the African women's voices on issues of war and armed conflict must become part of the narrative of the global women on issues of what they go through during situations of war.
Throughout this trajectory with Isis-WICCE, How did you experience, say, the obstacles, but also the resources available for women who are victims of conflict? How have you seen that evolve and change? And if you could give any insights into that process, and what's it like to even identify the key stakeholders in these things, and how do you reach out to these communities?
When we came from Beijing, as Isis-WICCE team, we were now confident that this is a niche that we must drive from now to whenever the wars end. And since you know that the wars have never ended, yes, Women International Peace Center is continuing. But from my perspective as a communicator, I went to my executive director at that time and said, we must break this silence of thinking that you can only get to know what women are thinking by reading books. Knowing that African culture is oral, there is no way we are going to sit in the documentation center and wait for women to come and write or research from what other women from Asia and Europe has written about and write their own stories. That is not the context in Africa. So the opportunity that we had was to go out to them. That was the only way we would bring their voices into the mainstream documentation center where elite women would be able to read about the voices of these women who never went to school, but they are knowledgeable of what happens to them. And as Nina, you know, majority of people who suffer in situations of armed conflict are vulnerable, rural setting, who have no information, who have no radio to know that the war is coming and they get out of those places and go into safer places, who are poor, who cannot do anything. So how do you bring their voices to be heard? And the only solution was to start going to the communities where these women who experienced war or were still experiencing war were. In Uganda, we went to central Uganda in a place called Luwero district. We worked in northern Uganda, which has about 6 districts. We worked in northeastern Uganda, which has also about 5 districts. We went to northwestern Uganda in one district called Kasese. And Nina, the stories were as if all these women were the attackers, the perpetrators of these women. It was one. And that started bothering me so much. Why is it that when soldiers and the warring factions get into communities, they first attack the woman's body? I mean, for me at that time, it didn't make any sense. Why do you look for this woman when actually the person with the gun is a man? One would argue that they would be asking them, where is your husband? But even after getting where their husbands were, the women were still attacked. The women were still sexually violated, raped, gang raped, mutilated. I couldn't just understand. And this bothered us so much. I went on reading around, trying to find out someone who has written about it so that I may understand the underlying cause of attacking a woman, a girl. But after a long time, 20 years, my perception was that they knew how strong a woman was. And indeed, when we went into these communities, the only people whom you could find still firm, resilient, looking for food, taking leadership, doing everything that you think about, trying to put up a small grass thatched house because their house has been burnt, are women. And I started adding 1+1, I said, okay, maybe they want to attack this woman because she's the pillar. In my paper, one paper I wrote to say, she's the temple of the community. And unless you break this temple, you can never break the fighters. Because the fighters, in my view, they tend to get so disillusioned when they come to know that their women have been attacked, they have been raped, gang raped. You know how humiliating that is. Because some were gang raped in front of their own children. So all this, I added it together and I just confirmed in myself. I've never done research on it. I've never done a PhD on it, but I write this from my own experience, that the only reason they attack the body of a woman is to destroy that community, because she is the pillar. So going back after researching the whole Uganda, researching Liberia, researching Nepal, being able to link up with the women we trained from Kashmir, I noted that if I continue waiting for the post-conflict reconstruction to take place, there will be no single victim surviving because of the wounds they had in their body, physical, mental, and psychological. As you ask, how do you get the resources and what partners? You know, Nina, sometimes it is the zeal that drives you. At that moment in Luwero, our organization had just received $8,000, 8. And we had just finished documenting, talking to the women, survivors of this 5-year war. And I told my boss I was not going to continue documenting women unless they are healed. And I remember my ED said, Ruth, you are asking for too many things. You want to document, you want to heal. Do one thing. I said, yes, I have documented, but there is nothing in me that is going to continue listening to the same story. The women knowing who raped them, what time it was, what he was carrying, what kind of clothes they were wearing. I mean, from one district to another, it is not the same man, but they are using the same systematic way of torturing women. So there's no need for me to continue unless we start healing these women and see whether they can become women again. I will not go into the details, others will get in my book. As an organization, we decided to go into partnership with medical professionals directly. Reason being, we were not going to wait for the post-conflict reconstruction, because from my own perspective and my experience, whenever the wars ended in DRC, of course it is still continuing, but all those that ended during my time, they would not start with women's bodies as a priority. They would start from the male's perspective with the aspects such as, the reconstruction of the infrastructure. True, we need to do that. Reconstruction of the legal systems. Yes, we need to do that. Reconstructions of roads and health centers. But Nina, for me, who was seeing how these old women and young women were passing on, were traumatized, were in pain, the main perspective doesn't see that as a thing that requires priority. So that's why we decided to go direct to work with the doctors. And yes, I'm glad we did that. I'm glad we were able to do that directly. I will not go into the details, but very many challenges, too many challenges. Medical professionals asking us how scientific was our research. And of course, my womanness in me, I stood up. I remember telling them, I am not going to go back to those women. and ask them for yet another scientific story.
Mm-hmm.
We must think of something. And okay, I was very emotional. And I think the doctors just said, but you don't know what you're putting yourself in. Everybody will come. I said, so long as some of them can come and they get healed, I will be satisfied. So we got camps. We came up with medical camps. The challenges were many, but we persevered. Thank God the consultants, the medical consultants, eventually embraced what we were doing. They realized they were seeing more than they were seeing in their hospitals, in the camps. They actually found out more than what we had told them as they were talking to these victims one-to-one. It was strenuous, it was long hours, but it was satisfying. It was so satisfying that at the end of this medical intervention, you would see a woman coming to the doctor and after they have healed to say, I don't know what to tell you, but I had taken 14 years without going to church because of the fistula, but now I can not stink. I can now go. And that was not enough to see psychiatrists and psychologists picking the documentation and the research we did, our participatory research, and continuing to study it and bringing up other forms of healing in Uganda that probably would not have happened. So for me, that was exciting to see young women, old women coming back and becoming human again.
Mm-hmm.
And taking up their responsibility as human beings to start their journey of nurturing communities as the culture has always been.
And I can imagine on this, the intergenerational approach, just creating a space for both older and younger women. I feel like this must propagate through the communities during these times of resilience and community rebuilding beyond, like you said, just infrastructure.
That one, I saw it more, not in my work at Isis-WICCE, but after I had stepped down, I was invited by Stephen Lewis Foundation to support them into just doing some M&E among grandmothers and other people who were vulnerable to the scourge of HIV and AIDS. And specifically, in this case, talking about grandmothers who were left with hundreds and hundreds of children who don't have father or mother. And you find this old woman of about 80 years, 79 years, is now the head of the household. And because of the approach that Stephen Lewis Foundation utilizes to give them the resilience, the power to care for them, you can't imagine what these old ladies have done south of the Sahara in Africa. They are the ones who are nurturing the young people, caring for the young people, educating them on so many aspects. They have now so much knowledge of how HIV and AIDS is contracted. They are able to sit with the children. Some of them were affected when they were just caring for their children. So they are able to take them through the process of closure, to let them know. And the way they have cared for these children, taken them to school using very minimal resources they have on them. Some have entered universities. Others are now giving back to the community. I just wish the world could have taken that approach that Stephen Lewis Foundation has taken to put money to where it belongs and see what grandmothers have done. I was humbled. I'm still humbled because every country I go to engage with these grandmothers, you can't believe they are now engaging with the policymakers. They sit down and tell them you are doing wrong things. You can't approach it that way and you get success. They are informing the local council of what they should do in order for communities to live happy, to live HIV free, and to feed children with nutritious meals. They didn't go to school, but they are doing all this. Africa, south of the Sahara, I have been in Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, Namibia, Swaziland, South Africa, Lesotho, name it. All grandmothers are the stars. Unfortunately, our governments have failed to see the power behind grandmothers. And that's why we are in this cycle of conflicts, different conflicts coming up. These grandmothers have already embraced the issue of climate change. You find them planting trees. They are telling people not to dig near the rivers.
The place is escaping me, but it was the grandmothers who drew up the legal case, I think, on climate change just last year.
Yes, I mean, they are doing it literally every day. Sometimes we don't get to know them because the media is so commercialized. It tends not to reach them. But I was privileged by Stephen Lewis Foundation, honored that I can go deep into these villages and find these grandmothers, sit down and they tell you how they have been able to prepare the traditional meals for people who are terminally ill, and you see them become normal again. They testify, and those who were terminally ill, they have looked after them. They have come back, their CDs are up again. They move, they dance. I mean, all the women doing what young people can't do in our communities. And that's why the whole grandmothers movement is so crucial for the survival of humanity, especially on my continent. Until we get the skill and knowledge that these senior women have, until we start soliciting funding to bring together the young women, the old women, to have that intergenerational conversation, the young to read from the old. I know the old will also read from the young, but it will be mainly the challenges the young are facing today, because your times are very complicated. But the wisdom of the old will be able to navigate and help the young to know how to go about it. When we started the medical intervention, we had only $8,000. It wasn't even for such an intervention. It was for networking sexual and reproductive health. But we decided to interpret sexual and reproductive health from our context of what we are seeing on the ground. And after that, we were able to pick other resources that took us to do an intervention in Liberia, to do an intervention in South Sudan. So grandmothers are seated with power, with knowledge, with the resilience that they can really pass the baton on the young people to know that this world is not for the weak, and patriarchy has never left. Our issues will never sail through very freely. It will have to go through a lot of navigation and push and pull, push and pull. And as I speak now, I want to remember one of my mentors. This is a lady who was so powerful. She just passed on 2 days ago. Her name was Annie Walker. Annie Walker was the executive director of the Tribune Center in New York. this Australian woman was a power. She pushed the Security Council left, right, and center to making sure that we African women can go and talk to the Security Council about wars in Africa. And she did it articulately. She died over 80 now, but she used her pen to make people understand women's human rights. And if I did not meet such a woman to be one of my mentors, I don't think I would have been able to take all the advocacy I took in New York under the CSW. We would go to the Women Tribune Center and would sit and she would mentor us and prepare us before we go. She was white. She didn't need to care, but to care, the wars were in Africa. But because she believes that a woman's problem, whether white, black, yellow, name it, is the same problem we face globally. And that war affected any other woman outside Africa. She did her work. And for us, we got that opportunity because the resources then, bilaterals, were giving money. The NORADs of this world, the Daninas of this world, Oxfam Novip of this world, Ford Foundation, Open Society, they were all ready to resource the women's movement. And that's how we managed to link up with women like Annie Walker. She has rested, but she has left legacy because the rest of us who are nurtured by her, we are still continuing the game.
Yeah. And you guys continue to activate other women.
Exactly. And that's what, and that's why I'm saying resources need to be given to all the women who have organized themselves in a movement. That's the only thing that is going to save this planet, because women are all connected. Women are the ones who are focusing on the vulnerable group of people. Look in Gaza, look in Ukraine. It is the women who are pulling everybody who seems not to have anything around him. They are the ones who are dying because they are trying to protect others. But if all the women across the world were resourced to be able to engage like I'm engaging with you, this world would be different. But we seem not to see the power of a grandmother. Instead, we are seeing the power of the gun. And fortunately, the gun that has been ranging from 1914 to today, it hasn't brought us any happiness. It hasn't. But I've given you my little story, which has brought happiness to some women who would have died a long time ago. But they are still living and helping others.
And their legacies as well, like you said. Crucial work. So looking forward, Ruth, what do you hope your own legacy will be for future generations? And what do you look forward to in the upcoming years, both personally, because I know you said you were a grandma, so maybe it's something to do with your grandchildren, but also more professionally in your work?
As I told you, retiring doesn't mean I'm tired. When I stepped down, I met other women who were as vibrant as I was on issues of women and peace and women, peace and security. And one of them is Patricia Cooper, who is in Colorado. We met, we discussed, we laughed. And from the word go, we just connected. And by that time, she had started a women regional network in Afghanistan and South Asia. And I just said, but why can't I start a women regional network for peace building in East Africa? So we have a network. It is still young, but it is mobilizing young women, mobilizing women to understand peace from a broader perspective, engaging women to deconstruct the word conflict and be able to understand that a woman is living in conflict every day from her own household to the streets of her communities. She's in conflict, and all these are conflicts that we need to start working on. So my legacy has started by nurturing young people in East Africa. Whoever I meet, wherever space I'm given to talk about women and peace building, women and justice, human rights, I tell them, don't go into what the definitions that were given to us as conflicts. Look at your life as a life that is living in conflict, and try to deconstruct those conflicts and finding ways and means of doing that. We do it at a very minimal way because of lack of resources, but most of the time we are doing it online. We meet once a year from Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania, just to come together and see what is it that we are seeing in our countries, how have we dealt with whatever we have dealt with. I have continued documenting the stories of women peace activists in this network, and it is amazing to see the different perspectives of their peace work, which is very different from what the world calls peace building. And that excites me. That is a legacy I'm seeing. Also, presently, in the Women's Situation Room of Uganda. This Women's Situation Room is a Pan-African mechanism, a mechanism that believes that we cannot just see our communities go into fire whenever there is election. And we have this situation room to see to it that we engage youth and women to be activists in bringing peace into their communities. So my travel to this city, I've come to talk to stakeholders here because we are having our elections in next year. So we have started organizing and mobilizing and making sure that we meet very many women groups and we really take them through issues of peace building, mediation, how do you mediate, conflict resolution, and early warning and early response, so that on the election day, when we have our physical room, we have a group of young women and youth, both boys and girls, who can call in and say there is some little fire here. And as a mechanism, we immediately respond to it to find out who is responsible, what can be done, so that it doesn't blow up into a huge crisis when we can actually mitigate it. Yeah. And lastly, my grandchildren. I have grandchildren who are very exciting young women. The first three young girls whom I'm also mentoring to really believe in themselves. The others are still young. I have 8 grandchildren from my 2 children, my son and my daughter. Yeah, and I'm always happy and proud when they ask questions, and yes, we engage. So that will be probably my legacy and my story of my book. I hope I will get an editor to be able to finally look into my scripts, which are ready. And actually, I wanted to talk to you and the grandmothers, because when we met online, there was one who said she likes reading scripts and should. So it would be exciting for me to get one who can do the final looking into it before it is published. Yeah.
Oh, how exciting. Wow. Okay. Well, this was very, very amazing. And I'm so glad I got to speak to you about all of this. There's always one question. We usually start with them, but it's also fine to end with it. But do you have any traditions from growing up that now as a grandmother and maybe even as a mother, you passed on to your children or your grandchildren?
Yeah, there are quite a number of traditions in Africa, but I must say my father, having been a priest, the religion kind of made him when the missionaries came, they tended to tell our fathers and grandfathers that the things they were believing in were kind of satanic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, my father, having become a priest, he really protected us quite a lot from knowing a lot of traditions because of now his new narrative of his new faith. So I must tell you that there were quite a few I got from my grandmother, and it is usually something to do with how you behave when visitors are at home, how a young woman sits, how a young woman greets. I mean, they were all these aspects which today we would say that it is part of this thing that made women to be second class, you know. The woman is supposed to sit like this, but a boy can sit anywhere. And then there was this whole thing which, thank God, my father decided that was useless, that girls don't eat chicken. So chicken was not for girls to eat. It was only for men. So eggs were not for women to eat. So you found that everything that gave you protein, the women were not supposed to eat. So I was like, oh, at least my father's faith helped me not to go that way.
To stay strong.
And we ate them. There was no problem, but all my cousins would come and say, oh my God, Ruth eats chicken. But But my grandchildren, I think I've left them to be. The only thing I have taught them are values. The values of respect, the values of having dignity in all that you do, the values of appreciating others, the values of working very hard, the values of being accountable to whatever you do, the value of not sitting there and feeling sad for yourself, but a value that gives you the self-esteem and knowing that you can do everything on earth. And whenever I see them get into this present fear, which I feel has destroyed some values that made me who I am, then we sit down and have a conversation with them.
Thank you so much for your time. And I'm sure that the Grandmother Collective and your work and your groups will be in touch. And I'm very excited to see your book eventually.
Yes, I'm also excitedly, I've taken it through 2 editors. Now it is in the final one. But I really wanted somebody who is not here to read it and ask more questions, critique it, so that by the time it comes out, it's real on the Amazon, and people read it globally, because it entails quite a number of things which are beyond Africa.
Thank you for joining us for this special episode of Grandma Magic. We hope you were inspired by today's conversation with Ruth Ochieng and gained new insights and inspiration for change. If you're as passionate as we are about amplifying the voices and wisdom of grandmothers, we invite you to get involved. Follow the Grandmother Collective on social media to stay connected and discover more stories of changemakers around the world. You can also participate in our storytelling initiatives. Submit your own stories for our Substack publication, The Power of Grandmothers, or join our storytelling circles to share your experiences and connect with others in meaningful ways. And don't forget to subscribe to Grandma Magic wherever you listen to podcasts so you won't miss future episodes filled with the inspiration, wisdom, and enduring magic of grandmothers and older women everywhere. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.